who controls the world? Is it the President of the United States? Or China? Russia? Or is it a secret group of people that we can't see that are pulling the strings? Is it the top 1%? Or is it the corporations that are only concerned with making a profit? Most people know that there are some hidden, dark forces that control everything, but it can be hard to pinpoint exactly what or who they are. You may be shocked to learn that banks, specifically central banks like the Federal Reserve, have control over the economy, social, and even political landscape. We are going to take a deep dive and uncover the secrets that they've been trying to keep hidden from you for so long that are now exposed. The beginning. Status quo. To understand how banks control not only a country but the entire world, we need to understand what money is and how we ended up where we are. Before the rise of banks, the control and influence over societies were typically held by a combination of religious institutions, monarchies, and the ruling elite. The concept of banking began in ancient Egypt, with merchants offering loans of grain to farmers and traders carrying goods between cities. This laid the foundations for the systems that modern banks would use. Then, in medieval Europe, goldsmiths started issuing receipts for the gold and silver deposited with them. These receipts became a form of paper money, as they were easier to carry and trade than heavy metals. The first true banks began to emerge in Renaissance Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries, in cities like Florence and Venice. These banks accepted deposits, made loans, and transferred funds across Europe. This is when the power and control started to shift more to banks. As banking developed, banks started to issue what are called banknotes, or promises to pay the person the amount of precious metal deposited. This practice led to fractional reserve banking, where banks keep only a fraction of deposits as reserves and lend out the remainder to earn interest. There was a need to regulate and stabilize the money supply, which led to the creation of central banks. In 1694, the Bank of England was established, which was one of the earliest central banks. Central banks issued currency-controlled interest rates and served as a lender of last resort to prevent financial panics. This is one of the most pivotal moments in which banks gained significant economic control and forged the path to the modern central banks that we know today. The first two central banks of the US. The creation of the Bank of England in 1694 laid the groundwork for central banking systems worldwide, including the Federal Reserve System in the United States. Before the Federal Reserve, the United States had a fragmented banking system, with state-chartered banks issuing their own currency. Two attempts to establish a central bank, the first and second banks of the United States, were made in the late 18th and early 19th centuries but were met with political opposition and were not renewed after their charters expired. Among the opponents of the first central bank were Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State at the time, and James Madison, a leading member of Congress. They were worried about the concentration of financial power in the hands of a federal institution and its potential to undermine state authority. Jefferson, in particular, argued that the Constitution did not grant the federal government the authority to establish a bank, advocating for a strict interpretation of the Constitution. The most formidable opponent of the second bank was President Andrew Jackson, who viewed the institution as a hydra-headed monster that represented the privileged interests of the wealthy elite over the common man. Jackson's opposition to the bank was a central issue of his presidency. The first bank's charter was not renewed in 1811, partly due to the opposition it faced and the political climate favoring states' rights, and the second bank's charter was vetoed by President Andrew Jackson in 1832, a decisive action that effectively ended its operation as a central bank once its charter expired in 1836. Jackson's veto was celebrated by his supporters as a victory for democracy and the common man against a corrupt elite, although it led to a period of financial instability and contributed to the Panic of 1837. The rise of the Federal Reserve. Before the Federal Reserve, the United States experienced several financial crises, with the Panic of 1907 serving as a particularly stark wake-up call. The banking panic highlighted the fragility of the US banking system, largely due to its decentralization and the lack of a lender of last resort. This event spurred a push for reform to stabilize and secure the nation's financial system. The most direct planning for the creation of the Federal Reserve took place in November of 1910 on Jekyll Island, Georgia. Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, a leading figure in banking reform efforts, invited a group of powerful bankers and financial experts to a highly secretive meeting at the Jekyll Island Club. Participants included Henry P. Davidson, senior partner at J.P. Morgan's company, Paul Warburg, a partner at Kuhn Loeb's company, and a key advocate for central banking in the U.S., Frank A. Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York, A. Pyatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, Benjamin Strong, representing J.P. Morgan. The guise was a dog-hunting trip, and the meeting was kept secret to prevent public scrutiny and potential backlash from those opposed to central banking. The attendees used only first names or pseudonyms to maintain anonymity. During the meeting, the group drafted a plan for a central bank that would address the issues of elasticity of the money supply and provide a unified banking system with a central authority. The plan sought to balance the interests of private banks and public control, resulting in a decentralized central bank system with both public and private elements. After refining their ideas and garnering support, the plan was presented to Congress. It underwent several revisions to appease different political and regional interests, including those wary of giving too much power to either Wall Street or the government. The Federal Reserve Act was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson on December 23, 1913. The act established the Federal Reserve System with a central governing board, the Federal Reserve Board, 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, and a combination of public and private control. Its primary goals were to provide the country with a safer, more flexible, and more stable monetary and financial system. The Federal Reserve was tasked with setting monetary policy, regulating banks, ensuring the stability of the financial system, and serving as a lender of last resort. How the Fed controls the world. The Federal Reserve is a private institution, not part of the government. Not even the president can veto the decisions that the Fed makes. There are several mechanisms through which banks, particularly central banks like the Federal Reserve, exert control over a country's economy and, by extension, its political landscape, using money. Issuance of money. Central banks have the ability to print money. This money is not backed by anything and comes out of no accounts or reserved. It's simply created out of nothing. Creating money increases inflation, lowering the value of your dollars. If the Fed wants to cause a recession, all they have to do is to reduce the money supply. Therefore, the Fed has the sole ability to cause economic growth as well as cause recessions. Then, interest rates. Central banks set the interest rates at which they lend money to commercial banks. Lower interest rates make borrowing cheaper, encouraging spending and investment by businesses and consumers. Higher rates have the opposite effect, cooling down an overheated economy but potentially leading to higher unemployment. Like mentioned before, when the Fed lends money to commercial banks, it creates the money out of thin air. Fractional reserve banking. This system allows commercial banks to lend out many times more money than they actually have in deposits, subject to reserve requirements set by the central bank. This creates new money in the form of bank credit, expanding the money supply and facilitating economic growth. However, it also means that banks can significantly influence the economy through their lending policies. In 2020, the new reserve for banks was set at 0%. Debt creation. Governments often borrow money from central banks and the private sector to cover budget deficits. This borrowing increases national debt, which must be serviced with interest payments. Through the creation of government debt, banks can exert influence over government policies because the need to service debt can dictate government spending and taxation policies. Economic cycles. By manipulating interest rates and the money supply, central banks can influence economic cycles, potentially leading to periods of economic expansion, followed by contraction. This control over economic cycles can have profound effects on the employment rate, stock markets, and the overall economic well-being of a country. Political influence. Banks, through their control over money and credit, possess significant political influence. They can lobby for legislation that benefits the banking sector, resist regulatory changes that might reduce their profits, and influence public policy through their financial power. As you may have noticed, when new money is created, it creates a debt. That debt is to be paid for by you, the US taxpayer. We don't have a cash monetary system. We have a debt-based monetary system. In order for the economy to continue to grow, the debt must grow. But the Federal Reserve just affects the United States, right? Wrong. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency and is backed by the faith and credit of the US government. and the US dollar is backed by nothing. It used to be backed by gold, but now the gold has left the hands of the US and is held by foreign powers and other entities, making a switch back to the gold standard not only extremely deadly to the US, but nearly impossible. What is the conclusion? So the banks control the world. They control the money. They print it out of thin air. It's not backed by anything. What can you do? Is it all hopeless? This is not financial advice, but some steps you could think about taking are putting your money into assets, not liabilities. We've been conditioned to spend, go into debt, and consume. Think more of how you can invest, earn passively, and produce. Saving cash in a world where cash is backed by nothing is a sure way to work your life away and not have much to show for it. Think about putting your cash into assets and investments that keep up with inflation. It's typically recommended to have 3 to 6 months of liquid funds in the case of an emergency. One of the most powerful tools you can utilize to create wealth is leverage. A common form of leverage in our world is debt. You can use debt for liabilities and consumption, which is what we are conditioned to do. Or you can use debt for assets and production. For example, getting a mortgage for a house to live in versus getting a mortgage for a house to rent out. Getting a car loan for a car to drive versus getting a car loan to start a business on Turo. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about money and how to create wealth, make sure to subscribe. If you want to become rich, make sure you watch this video. See you there.